Welcome, Carol Sawyer from Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education. We appreciate so much your time this morning. This past week, for our guests, we had a conference in Raleigh, North Carolina called The Impact of Privatizing Our Public Schools. Carol was gracious to join a panel of other school board members last Saturday, and we realized that much of our citizens were busy doing other things, weren't able to join us. And Carol offered to come back and talk with us a little bit more about some of the impacts that are going on in her school system so we can share this information more broadly. So today, I just want to thank you again, Carol, for coming last Saturday. And here you are Saturday again. So welcome. I want to tell everybody a tiny bit about Carol. She was elected to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education in 2017. She's a member of the policy committee there, chairs the facility and operations committee, and she holds master's degrees from the University of Pennsylvania and George Washington University, and earned her bachelor's degree in psychology at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Carol has served as director of exhibits and planning at the Museum of Life and Science, and as a consultant to nonprofit organizations, including Public Schools First. Carol has been working with Public Schools First since we began, and was actually one of those folks who we consulted with to help us get going here in Raleigh when we were working on advocacy issues around the Wake County Board of Education. She is also the co-founder of advocacy organizations One MEC and Mecklenburg Acts. So Carol, one of the things I wanted to start our conversation with this morning is that a lot of folks have been asking us, you know, what is privatization? What does that mean? And so we've been talking with folks about some of the legislative impacts that have been directed towards our public schools, which has shifted some of the public education funds and our students to the private sector. And a lot of folks have been saying, so what's going on? So this was something we pulled together and shared at the conference, was just kind of an overview of some of the changes in our public schools in terms of students and funding. And as you can see, I won't read this whole list, but one of the biggest things that happened in our public school system was the implementation of the voucher program. We did not, a decade ago, we did not have vouchers for private schools, and we do now. They had a cap on charter schools of only allowing 100 of the best charter schools to operate. And as you see, we now have the cap has been lifted, and those dynamics have changed. And one of the things that I know that Carol will be talking about today is some of this new legislation about municipal controlled funded charter schools. And Carol, I just wondered if you had any comments about any of the data here before we moved on and talked a little bit about what's going on in Charlotte. How have any of these issues impacted your school system this year in particular?
Well, you know, I think we have to look at the privatization move as being quite intentional. It's a national push. It's not just in North Carolina. And it's an attempt to undermine public education. So that's, you know, you have to just start there and say that these initiatives are a direct attack on truly public schools. You know, Mecklenburg County has lots of charter schools. I think I didn't do the final count, but it's I think it's in the 25 to 30 range of charter schools in Mecklenburg County. And I think if you count the charters that are attended by students in Mecklenburg County, those just over the county line, we're closer to 40. So we have we're hugely impacted by charter schools. Voucher school.
I shared here with our guests just kind of an overview of what's been going on in the state as a whole. And when charter schools began operation in the late 90s, the whole goal was to look for a way to have small schools that were operating as a incubator to look at ways to do innovative instruction or program presentation, changing up some of the structures, and was put in place with the CAP and pretty stringent application process to have charters be operating. And you can see that when the CAP was lifted, what we've seen is in 2013, we saw kind of a level number of charters, some coming in the market, going out of the market, but the ones that were doing pretty well were stabilized and were there. And then we can see right here, when the cap came off of charters, we see this huge growth here, which is, it seems to be unstoppable. It really has impacted, Carol, a lot of the urban areas. And when you say just across the line, I take that to mean that that also is pulling your students out of your schools, because charter schools, you do not have to be a resident in the
right. So we send Mecklenburg County school system sends money to Cabarrus County, to Union County, to neighboring counties, as our money, our county supplement money follows students to other counties.
Well, I was going to ask this later on in the presentation, but you brought up a question point that many people ask us about. What about all this funding? So when kids enroll in charter, you send money to that charter school. What happens if those kids come back to your school system? That's a question we get asked all the time.
Well, I believe the state, and you can help me on this, I believe the state money is paid out twice a year. Is that true?
Right. Yeah.
So if students are in a charter school after the 20-day count, that charter school gets the money for that semester from the state. If on the 21st day that student moves from a charter school to CMS, we don't get that money. But for local money, it's my understanding that we actually pay our local money on a monthly basis and require some proof of admission before we pay out. Proof
and
of,
I've added this chart here for everybody to see as Carol's talking about the money that's coming out of. I do remember last week, Christine Kushner talking about $45 million a year out of local funds for Wake County are going to the various charters.
More than that. I don't remember the number offhand, but I didn't look it up. But
well, you have a few more charters. I think you have the most charters.
Yeah,
we're right behind you.
I want to in the 60 million range, but I honestly, I don't want to quote a number.
That sounds about right from something I read. And so this is the cumulative. Folks have also asked about the number of students, and you can see that this is the current up to the projected number of kids in the system here, all the way up into projected for this year. So you see how many kids are coming out of our public school system, and the money is coming with them. And this is a very, I think, illustrative chart here that shows that the cumulative total state funding that will be that's spent as of now is, is in the billions. This is a lot of money.
I often get the question, people also say, well, the money follows the child. Why does that hurt the school district? And I think it's worth taking a moment to explain how that money leaves the system and why it hurts the school district. So if a charter school opens up in Mecklenburg County, that school doesn't have an attendance boundary. Students can technically come from anywhere in the state to that school. And so if a charter opens up in the midst of, say, East Charlotte, it may pull students from all over or half of Mecklenburg County. And it will pull students, one from this school, one from that school, a fifth grader from here, a fourth grader from there. So while any individual school may lose 5 students over 6 grades, their operating costs don't really go down. They still require the same number of buses, they still require the same number of teachers, they still require the name of support staff, social workers, cafeteria workers, principal, vice principal, all those staff remain the same. But we have lost the operating money that would have come from the state. That's very different from when CMS opens, say, a new school to relieve overcrowding. We move students to fill all the grade levels in all the classrooms, so we balance that operating support. But if you just take 1 or 2 students out of a classroom across the district, it impacts our bottom line, but it doesn't reduce our expenses. It reduces our income, but not our expenses.
I think that's a very good point, Carol. But so it's just the economy of scale, right? It's just not cost effective. And the next chart I wanted to kind of ask you to comment on, and this is another thing that has been of concern to a lot of education advocates, is that we have put a lot of money. We've showed the number of kids that we're pulling out of our schools. We see the cumulative impact of billions of dollars out of our public school systems. And then we see that this was a pulling together the data that was done by Policy Watch a couple weeks ago. And what it reveals is that we don't really see a lot of differences in educational outcomes for kids. Could you talk about this a little bit and what your experience is in Charlotte?
Well, I mean, what we see is the schools that, if you match demographically charter schools and traditional public schools, there tends not to be any difference in performance. But you need to remember that charter schools have a significant advantage. So we're not on a level playing field, and even so, traditional public schools are performing the same level. Let me just give you one huge difference and huge advantage that charter schools have. In our Title I schools, we have high student mobility. Families have unstable housing, they move, they get bounced from apartment complex to apartment complex, they move around the district. And so some of our schools have upwards of 60% student mobility over the year. So that means, and that's a stunning figure when you think about it, that, you know, sort of a look to the left, look to the right, only one of you will be here, will have remained in this school for the entire school year. So it's a very, it has a profound impact on a school, because whether they're people who are moving to Mecklenburg County, they may be immigrants and refugees just arriving to Charlotte. Those students enter school every day of the school year across our district. And that requires teachers to, you know, reintroduce basic concepts. It requires students to reestablish classroom norms. It's a challenge. Charter schools don't face that challenge. They admit students at the beginning of the year, and they are under no obligation to add students throughout the year. As a matter of fact, it's not in their financial best interest to add students for the rest of the year. So that's one advantage. The other advantage that charter schools have is that they tend to counsel out or push out students with high needs. So they are not inclined to take students that are frankly expensive to educate. Charter schools also tend not to offer high schools, which are more expensive. Right. So in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools, we see an uptick in enrollment at 9th grade, because again, charter schools are using that average per pupil cost to educate the easiest, the least expensive students to educate. And then when it comes to high school, they're out, they tap out by and large, and send those kids back to Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools.
Wow, that is really fascinating. And I think we're seeing that same phenomenon at the statewide level. I wanted to also not forget to talk a little bit about House Bill 514, a very controversial bill that was passed last year in the General Assembly, and it was targeting Mecklenburg County. Can you tell us a little bit about this bill? Sure. and how it's impacting your school system?
Right. So the House Bill 514, it's now a state law, but it's usually referred to by its initial bill name, created municipal charter schools, or the possibility of municipal charter schools. And this is, let me step back a little bit as to how we got here. Charlotte-Mecklenburg County has the city of Charlotte, 3 small towns in the north, and 3 towns in the southern perimeter. There have been ongoing efforts by those towns over time to withdraw from CMS, to secede from CMS, to form their own school districts. There have been lots of chatter and talk about that for a long time. Now, the towns surrounding around the perimeter of Mecklenburg County are whiter and more affluent than the rest of the county. So there is certainly a racial and class reason that these towns want to create their own isolated school districts. They have not been able to do that. They've not been able to create new LEAs to satisfy that secession urge. And they worked with Bill Brawley to create a workaround, which is in effect to allow the towns to create their own municipal charter school. And this is fundamentally different from the regular charter schools. Municipal charter schools have a priority attendance zone. So if the town of Matthews wants to open a municipal charter, that charter would be filled by students living in the town of Matthews before other students could attend. And that's fundamentally different from any other charter school, where technically a student in Mecklenburg could attend a charter school in Wake County if they could get there in time for school every day. So that bill passed. It's frankly a flawed bill. Technically, it has some oddities in it. But it has become a sort of Damocles that towns use to threaten the schools, Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools, when we start talking about pupil assignment and where to locate schools. So they use it as a threat to say, well, if you change our boundaries in this way, we will form a municipal charter and we will pull out of CMS. So that's how it's been used. Interestingly, the town of Cornelius has now said they have no intention of forming a municipal charter, and they want to be sort of back in the good graces with Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. I should also explain that when this bill passed, Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools responded to that law by saying that one, that we would form a committee of representatives from each of the 6 towns and the city of Charlotte and school board members to talk about the needs expressed by the municipalities, to try to build some partnerships there. But also that it would not be fiscally responsible for Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools to plan new schools within the municipalities that were participating in the municipal charter system. And that's a strictly fiscal decision. If the town of Matthews is planning on opening a municipal charter elementary school in the town of Matthews, it doesn't make sense for Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools to open a new school in the town of Matthews. So we prioritized towns and areas of the county that were not planning to open municipal charters. The towns haven't liked that, but that is the only fiscally responsible response.
Well, Carol, let me stop you for a second and ask you a question, because that makes a lot of sense to me. Why would you take tax dollars, open a brand new elementary school, and then not have a population to attend?
Right. So yeah,
And not have any, you know, if the town only has, you know, 800, typically 800 or to 1,000 kids who would be at any time eligible to be in an elementary school by age, how could you have two schools to provide those? And in fact, the reverse is happening in some of our rural areas, as you are aware. We've had a couple of our rural school systems where a charter has come in, opened up, and now the public school is threatened with having to close some schools because they can't. There's not enough kids to support, you know, an additional high school. And one rural county, a charter high school did come in and took half of the kids from the high school. Now we have a high school that is operating with half the budget, half the students, and half the funds. And it's you know, it's threatening the longevity of that school in that community. Now, the sad thing about that too, and I think you've made very good decisions, is that even if you thought you may have enough kids for the school, you open it, and then the charter pulls out, then you may have built a school too small. You may have to, or you have a school that's too big, you close it. It's very complicated fiscal decisions. Right. And that doesn't even. How has the public responded to this? You know, in general, how do you think the folks in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, your citizens, your taxpayers, have responded to this bill?
Well, the main proponents of the bill have been defeated in their reelection campaigns. The residents of Matthews, I attended one of the public, the towns did this with very little or no public input. They just sort of signed on. But the town of Matthews had one public hearing during which I believe a dozen or more people spoke against participating in the municipal charter. Just one speaker was pro, who happened to be a legislative assistant in the, who had been in the office of the proposing legislator. But the overwhelming response was people wanted to stay with CMS. The Matthews mayoral and town council election that's happening right now, one of the main aspects of that campaign is relationships to Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools and municipal charters. So
very interesting.
The mayor that pushed. Sorry.
I saw that the other issue that some folks that I've heard from Charlotte that have been concerned about is the ability that the law gave the city council members to run the charters themselves and to raise property taxes to fund the schools. That seems like that's double taxing our citizens, and in a very cost ineffective way.
Yeah, actually, because of the change in state law, that is actually a statewide change because of the charter school bill. Municipalities across the state are now allowed to give tax dollars to schools. So we can go to the city of Charlotte, which has never been a funding partner, and say, hey, pay up, as can any municipality across the state. The complication with the municipal charter funding is that if Matthews opens a municipal charter, they will receive the county pass-through money for their school. However, students, unlike a regular charter, not every student in the county has an option to go to that school. So that because of the priority for Matthews town residents to attend that charter, even though I don't live in Matthews, but my tax dollars would be supporting that school, but my children in my neighborhood couldn't attend there.
Wow. It seems like the bill wasn't well thought out, but I'm wondering how many, do you have an estimate of how many kids come back from charter schools to your school system each year? Do you have an indication?
I don't have a
It's kind of
number.
hard record keeping, I know. I was just curious. And Carol, one of the reasons we've gotten into this situation with charters and vouchers and education savings account, all of these tools that are used to privatize, to pull money from the public school system into the private sector, has been around this concept of that we need to allow choice. I would like to ask you to comment on that a tiny bit and talk about the choice that is available to parents within the Charlotte-Mecklenburg system.
Charlotte-Mecklenburg has a huge array of choices through magnets and programs. Actually, right after this, I'm going down to there's a big school options fair downtown in preparation for next year's school choice lottery. We have everything from language immersion and dual language programs, from Mandarin, Japanese, Spanish, French, German. We have all manner of STEM and STEAM schools. We have visual and performing arts schools. We have a host of career and technical pathways. We've expanded those dramatically in the last few years, and now are providing, students are graduating. I think we have the latest numbers, like 9,000 certifications, job certifications, that CMS pays for those tests, so that if they pass the test, they can go to their employer and already have that, whether it's an OSHA or a food handling certification, in their pocket and are ready to start work. We also have partnered with Goodwill for a new facility that just opened, that is a building trades program that is across the street from one of our high schools. So during the day, students from the high school come and learn building trades, and in the evening it's run by Goodwill as an adult education place. So they're doing all building trades, HVAC, all those kinds of things.
That is wonderful. And you know, one of the consequences that we've seen statewide of the charter movement and the addition of the voucher program has been that it is added to the segregation of our schools. And how is that operating in Charlotte-Mecklenburg? How are those pulls out in the marketplace, pulling kids out of your schools? Is that contributing to the issues around segregated schools and high poverty schools?
Yes, absolutely. To the extent that our charter schools are as segregated or more segregated statewide than the traditional public schools, that certainly contributes. We have many families that move into integrated neighborhoods, opt out of the local elementary school and opt into a charter school that is predominantly white. So they become, in the words from the time after Brown, segregation academies, where they become a place for white affluent parents to pull their kids out of the traditional public school and put them in a publicly funded, basically private school. That has happened repeatedly. We've had cases in Mecklenburg County where actual private schools were founded with the expectation that they would become charters as they, when they could continue their application. So we had tuition paying parents who are then grandfathered seats into the school when it becomes a charter.
Wow.
And then we are publicly funding those seats for those parents who had been paying tuition.
Well,
and that was originally set up with that in mind.
And I want to get back to this issue of segregation, but I want to just quickly show a few slides about vouchers when you mentioned the private schools, because here's what's been going on with vouchers since they began in just 2014 when they first started allocating funds for vouchers, and you can see that where we are projected to go over the next 5 or 6 years. And the thing about those vouchers, I thought it was very interesting to look and see that the majority of the voucher money since the beginning, 2014, 15, 16, and now this last school year, is going to religious private schools. The overwhelming majority, Christian literal biblical worldview is the green, and then Christian curriculum unknown are the blues, or religious unknown, and a very small percentage of the vouchers are going to non-religious schools. So this has begged the issue for many people in terms of the separation of church and state and how we're spending our private dollars to fund, public dollars to fund private schools. And are vouchers also adding to the issues with your market share in Charlotte-Mecklenburg? Have you noticed any loss of students to these voucher programs?
I don't think we are losing a significant numbers in Mecklenburg County. My sense is some of the big consumers of vouchers are in the Greensboro area. Mm-hmm. So we haven't, that's not the big impact here. However, I think that this is public money that is going to schools that have zero accountability. They don't teach to the state standards. They can teach anything they want. The League of Women Voters did a study of voucher schools in North Carolina and confirmed that 75% of them are teaching that the world is 6,000 years old and Noah and the ark is literal truth, and that science is a fraud. I mean, there is no rationality to the curriculum that we are paying for in North Carolina.
And you know, one of the as our time's ticking away here, and I wanted to make sure that I also have some chance to ask some questions from folks. But one of the things that we heard a lot about last week at the conference too, Carol, was this issue about these A through F grades and how they have been used to label schools and impact teachers, but also that they have in their own way created a narrative that our schools aren't doing very well, and therefore we need these option out of our school system. We need charters and vouchers and education savings centers and virtual charters, that all these things are being made available because our schools are, quote, failing and our schools are not doing well. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the impact of these A through F grades in Charlotte-Mecklenburg and your school district, and if you think that's impacted your market share in Charlotte-Mecklenburg.
It certainly creates a narrative, as you mentioned, that many of our schools are, quote, failing. And that's despite what you would see if you actually visited the school. I think the scores prevent people who live in the neighborhood who might wish to go to the school from attending the school. And it feeds a narrative that is not true about what's actually happening day to day in the school.
Right.
And I hesitate to say, I mean, the scoring itself is absurd because it's 80% proficiency, which is completely tracked by poverty, and 20% growth. However, I don't want to put too much stock in the growth scores because they are as absurd as the proficiency scores. So, you know, it's easy to say, well, we should just measure growth. But if you look into what that growth measure in, you realize that it's, well, first of all, it's a proprietary measure. No one's really sure what's in it. And it also has is created in ways that, you know, a teacher has growth score based on other teachers' work. So.
Well, I'm going to just stop here for a second, and we have a few questions that I want to give you a chance to answer before we let you get on with your school business today. And one question here is, what do you think are the top 3 funding issues facing your school system and the state at this time?
Well, you know, people say you can't just throw money at a problem. And my response is, let's try just once. Education is about people. It's about psychologists. It's about teachers. It's, you know, all the money is personnel money when you get right down to it. And we have starved our schools. And there have been various corporate initiatives to figure out how to create super teachers that reach more students. And these are proposed by the same wealthy people who would, you know, attend it or would send their kids to, you know, an Andover or an Exeter where you have, you know, seminar classes of 12. Let's try that. Let's fund schools so that we have 1 to 12 students in our classrooms and have Socratic seminars and really teach children and provide them the resources. I mean, that's an extreme, but I think that gets to the point that money does matter. Let's pay our teachers a living wage so that they're not having to work 2 or 3 jobs. Let's increase our teacher pay so that we attract people who see teaching as a viable career, not just something to do for a few years. So it's all about money.
And you did mention something that's very important to me that I've been very concerned about the last 5 years, and that's the number of helping professionals in our schools, the number of psychologists, social workers, counselors, nurses. I think that a lot of folks don't understand that the majority of that money has to come from the state, and some of it does come from locally, but it's a situation where you talked about starving. You have to make sure you have teachers and teacher assistants and principals first, and then, you know, and what gets shortchanged is the personnel, the helping professionals, I call them, folks that make sure that children and teachers have support services. Can you talk about that a tiny bit in terms of what you see some of the greatest needs are in not just your school system, but the state overall?
Well, it's clearly a huge issue, and in Mecklenburg County, we have 4,000 students who are identified as homeless.
Gosh.
And those are just the ones we know about. It's you know, likely that there are other students who are doubled up, who are in transition, that, you know, sort of don't get into the system to be identified. So, I mean, we have tremendous need. And some of that need is being created by us and by the state. We were able to increase our pay for bus drivers to $15 an hour, but our cafeteria workers and teaching assistants are, you know, we're raising that. We didn't have enough money to raise them to $15 an hour, but so the parents of our students are earning poverty wages from the very school system that they're attending. Wow. And that's a state issue. We have to raise, the county cannot take that entire burden of raising those minimum wages.
So Carol, here's another question. Someone wants to know, what are you doing in Mecklenburg to deal with high poverty schools? Are you trying to reduce those? What are your efforts right now?
Right now, we are trying to resource them, which is, in my mind, a stopgap. In the last pupil assignment review, we created a very small number of paired schools that would combined attendance zones of basically a high and low poverty schools. Those are now in their 2nd year. And I'm hoping that as the next pupil assignment review rolls around, we'll look for opportunities to do more of that. Our magnet schools have a weighted lottery to try and balance the attendance, the socioeconomic distribution within the school. But Mecklenburg County is a big place that is highly segregated by income and race. So there are parts of the county that are completely insulated from people of another race. I mean, there are some edges that we can work on, but there are large parts of the county that are highly racially and economically isolated.
And that also reflects in your housing patterns and
that's absolutely our housing pattern.
And you know, Mecklenburg is I live in Wake County. We're facing many of the same issues around housing patterns, which are segregated, and then the issue of transporting kids has become harder to do. The traffic is greater. Our highways are packed. Getting to work is one issue. Getting to school on a bus has become incredibly hard. So these are some of the things that are facing our school system, and we're very thankful for people like you who have, as in your heart and in your service to the school system, concern to try to make sure we have schools that are diverse, that are integrated, that are well balanced and funded. But so maybe I'll let the last question be more of like a comment from you, Carol. I mean, tell our audience, what can parents and community leaders do to support having a healthy integrated school system, to push back against the efforts around us to privatize and take money from our school system? So give us some advice on like what can parents in the community do to help you and your colleagues on the school board to really lift up a well-funded, diverse, integrated school system?
I think for parents who are looking at schools, I would ask them to not simply ask the neighbors in their bubble of experience about schools, but to actually go and visit and spend time in schools and look at their neighborhood schools. And that's especially true if their neighborhood school has a bad state grade. That there is no substitute for visiting a school, spending time, for volunteering to get a feel for the school. And I think they would be surprised and I think it's all about a personal decision that you will send your child to your neighborhood school to support an integrated school. It doesn't work if you say, well, I really like that my neighborhood school is starting to integrate, but I'm not ready to go there. I'm going to go to the charter school because, you know, I don't think my child can handle it, or I'm not willing to allow my child to go there. So it's a personal decision and every cumulative personal decision adds up to the structural problem that we're in now. So I think you have to acknowledge that. People have to acknowledge that their personal decision matters about when it concerns the health of the entire district. Clearly, we're always looking for volunteers, for people to contribute funds to PTAs, to tutor. I mean, there are lots of opportunities for being involved in schools that are vital.
Okay, and you know, the last something you said made me think of the concept of the original role of public education, which was to serve the common good. That it wasn't to be considered a private good, to be hoarded at the expense of one community over another. But some of the very first things said by our founding fathers around public education was that it had to be a free society, to be a strong democracy, that education had to be seen as something that every citizen was entitled to, regardless of their race, their gender, their socioeconomic status, if you would, their zip code. And so I really think that one of the theme of this conversation today was about how the impact of privatization was impacting our public schools. And we've been calling it a crisis in the making, maybe a man-made crisis in the making, because what we see is a lot of state legislative actions being taken and some local actions being taken that undermine the stability of our once vibrant public school system. The last thing I'll say is when we look about 10 years ago, the public school system had about 90% of the kids who were eligible to be in school age-wise were in public schools, traditional public schools. That has dropped to 80% now as a statewide age average. In Wake County, as an example, it's like 77%. And so as we see this continuing attack and this loss of the stability in one system of strong public schools, I like your message that parents really should kind of go forth with the idea of like, I am paying for public schools, I am going to participate in our public schools, and I'm going to look for ways to make them stronger and better through my time, my talent, and sometimes my donations, of course. Any last words? I'll leave the last words to you, Carol. I do want to say before I close, thank you for your service. I've known that you for a long time. You are dedicated to improving your community. You've always worked to be an advocate for children and teachers. And I'm so pleased that you now get to do that on the school board in Mecklenburg County. I hope they know how lucky they are to have you. But I'll let you have the last word about how we accomplish this common good of that public education is.
Well, I want to thank you, Yvonne, and Public Schools First for your work on this and your continued pushing on these issues. I think we have to both make personal decisions and understand that our personal decisions impact the public good, but we also have to look at the source of this, which is our state legislature, and we will not be able to change this until we make changes in the state legislature. And elections matter, and we need to vote and organize and make sure that we elect a state legislature that truly supports actual public education for all. Thank you, and have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you very much. And I'll say, folks, I hope that we did record this conversation. We will be hosting that on our YouTube channel in a few days. I do hope that if you missed the conference, that you will go to our YouTube channel, Public Schools First NC. You will be able to see Carol and her colleagues from across the state at the conference. We also, if you go on our website, and look under October 12th conference, we have all the charts that I showed you today are there if you'd like to share them with your friends or download them, print them, and share them at a PTA meeting or some other community meeting. And make sure you follow us on Facebook and get our newsletter. We have a tremendous amount of information that we try to share to keep you informed, because being an informed public education advocate means that you can be an informed public education voter. So we appreciate your time. Have a great day. Thank you again, Carol, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.